The church is a people on mission. Jesus calls us to be his witness, to spread his message from person to person to person. So how do we be on mission today? To share Jesus' story here in our city and to the ends of the earth.
A reading from the book of Acts, book of Acts 21, verses 17 through 36. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all of the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done through the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all of the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know that there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. When the 7 days were nearly over, some of the Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. When they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." This is the word of the Lord.
Hi, my name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors here at the meeting place. Hi. This summer, Hildy and I and our oldest daughter Amanda and her husband Jay and their 2 children, Cammie and Nathan, found ourselves at the Gimli Fair. And so we went to the booth where you buy all of your tokens. And then, of course, there's this question, like, what activities are we going to participate in? What roller coaster are we going to ride? Are we going to go on the Ferris wheel and all those things? And for some reason, these 2 little ones latched their eyes onto one of the things, which was the giant slide. Here it is, the giant slide. I don't know if it's the color or what the thing was, but somehow they were drawn to it. And so they went to check, and sure enough, everything was good to go, except that Nathan wasn't quite tall enough, so an adult had to go along. So, of course, Grandpa volunteered, because who wouldn't want to take a ride on a giant slide? And so we made our way up this narrow set of stairs, and like Cammie was up front. She's 7 years old. She was ready to go. Nathan was trying to keep up with her, and I'm trying to keep up with them. We get to the top. Cammie plunks herself down on the little burlap sack that's provided so she can slide down the slide, and I take my seat in the next lane to her on my sack. And then as the attendant picked up Nathan and brought him over my shoulder to set him on my lap, right in midair, Nathan saw down the slide and saw all the bumps, and suddenly it got a little too big for him. And so like a cat, he turned in midair. And the next thing, he had thrown his arms around my neck and he'd wrapped his legs around my side. And I looked down and his eyes were squeezed shut as hard as you can get. And I threw my arms around him. No force on earth could have come between us. And I said to him, Nathan, you're so safe. I'll look after you. I'll hold you all the way down. We're going to make it all the way down to the bottom, but you're going to be perfectly safe. It's going to be fine. Everything is going to be good. You can just trust me. And we started sliding down the slide. I wasn't paying attention to Cammie at all. I have no idea what happened to her because I was focused on Nathan. And I never stopped talking. I never stopped talking. In fact, if you look at the picture, you can see my arms are still wrapped around this kid. And his action, Amanda calls it koalaing, when he attaches himself that way. And I talked to her and asked permission to tell the story, and she said to me, she said yes, and she says it was a real highlight for me too, because I realized that as much as he turns to us as parents, that in that moment that he was able to turn to you and to trust you, to believe that you would attend to him, was nice to know that there is a greater support in his life, and he knows this to be true. My hope is to, in the midst of the turmoil of the story we're looking at today in the book of Acts, to engage you in a curiosity about our relationship with Jesus that he makes available to us. And so let's dive into the story. It's a fascinating story. Paul is returning to Jerusalem, which is the city in which this Christian movement that got started by Jesus, sort of found its place. The Holy Spirit was poured out at an event called Pentecost, and out of the city of Jerusalem comes this faith community that starts spreading the word about Jesus. And so Paul is part of this movement, and he's going to tell his story in a little while, so I'm not going to hurry there and let him tell it in his own words. But here's the thing, Paul returns to Jerusalem, and he returns to a community of people that understand that he's been out and about sharing the story of Jesus with Gentiles to take it beyond the Jewish faith communities. And there's some curiosity about what this looks like and how Paul is doing this. And so when he arrives, the people that care for him say to him, look, there are people who are pretty zealous about these things, and in order for you to find your way into this community, we're going to ask you to do something pretty crazy. There are 4 men who've recently decided, because they have experienced a special blessing from God, that they're going to commit themselves to a purification rite, which lasted for 40 days. It's called a Nazarene vow, and it includes literally a commitment to set aside their time to focus on God and just to be grateful to him. And because during this 40 days they wouldn't be allowed to work because they were committed to this purification process, they needed the cost of this to be covered, essentially the groceries for their families, etc. And so these people that care about Paul say to him, listen, you've just arrived. Why don't you join these 4 guys? And why don't you cover the expenses of this experience? And that will be a way for you to make your way into this faith community. And people will appreciate that you're still committed to who we are and what defines us as a community. And Paul agrees. And so one of the jobs is for him to go to the temple and say, because the last 7 days of these 40 days of purification, these last 7 days were spent in the temple. So he goes to the temple essentially to say, look, 4 guys and I are going to be coming at such and such a date at the end of these 40 days, so could we make sure that all the preparations are in place? And on the way there, this crazy thing happens where people spot him and understand him to be this person that's challenging the status quo, no longer sticking to the Jewish traditions and all the practices, but rather speaking to the Gentiles and inviting them to also experience the incredible life-giving presence of Jesus. But did he enforce upon those new believers all of the conditions that were true of Jewish faith communities? And clearly he hadn't been, and so this was unsettling to them. And there is such an uproar. There's such an uproar. The outcry of this is so great. Well, this is a time of festival in Jerusalem. Jewish people had come from all around the world to come and be in Jerusalem at this time. And the Romans, who were the governing authority of the day, understood that when you bring a large crowd of people together, you really should have resources in place to make sure you can manage them just in case things go off the rails. There's estimates that there were about 2,000 Roman soldiers in the fortress, which is at the northwest corner of the temple grounds, and it's in the fortress called Antonia, and this is where they were just in case they were needed. And so the Romans understood that there was a riot going on, and so they send the troops out to intervene, and so they recognize that all of this seems to surround Paul, and so they capture him, and they try to bring him into the barracks, into safety, and then they'll figure out what to do, and perhaps this will disperse the crowd. Well, on the way to the barracks, Paul says to the Roman commander, listen, could you give me a moment? And something ridiculous happens. Paul turns to the rioting crowd, and he stands before them to speak to them, and they become quiet to listen to him. And he speaks in Aramaic, and he speaks words that are to be endearing. He's trying to identify them. He says, brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel, who is like, he had already died a number of years back, but he was like the guru. He was like the guy within Jewish faith tradition. This person was like just respected as a spiritual leader. And Paul had studied under his mentorship specifically and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way, which was the movement, this early Christian movement is what it was called, to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. And now, I want to invite you to pay special attention to what Paul now begins to describe. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, which was Paul's name before he became Paul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting, he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. Paul has an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. This is not at Paul's initiative. This is not something that he was seeking. He was going there to do harm to this early Christian movement. He was trying to shut it down because in his zealousness for his Jewish faith, he was trying to put down this thing because it appeared to be a threat. And Jesus barges into his world and interrupts him on his way and engages Paul into a conversation. But really, if you look at the story, you discover very quickly it doesn't appear that Paul had any options. All he had to do was to listen to what Jesus said to him. The story unfolds. What shall I do, Lord? I asked. Get up, the Lord said, and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do. So you're going to get your marching orders there. My companions led me by the hand in Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me, but only Paul, not the others. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. And he stood beside me. And he said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very moment, I was able to see him. Then he said, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one. Jesus. And to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all the people of what you have seen and heard, and now what you are waiting for. What are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. And you and I would dismiss this. Not dismiss it, because we don't believe it, but we would say, yeah, but that's his experience. That's outrageous. That is outside of anything that we should expect to believe to be true of a relationship that we might have with Jesus. This is Paul's story. Let's continue. Paul returns to Jerusalem. Now, it should be said that Paul, in his describing the events of that particular day, doesn't capture all of the time. And so he continues to tell his story to the crowd, and he jumps ahead to a time when he returns to Jerusalem, and I was praying at the temple. So now this is Paul not being interrupted by Jesus, but rather going to the temple, because this is where he understands, based on his Jewish background and study and learning, that the temple is associated with the presence of God. So he's praying at the temple because he's reaching out and wanting to hear from God. So he goes and prays at the temple. Can you go back one slide, Joel, please? I fell into a trance, you might say a dreamlike state, and saw the Lord speaking to me, as had been prophesied over him by Ananias, that this is what Paul would be able to do. Quick, he said, this is Jesus speaking, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. And this is where now he says the thing that really set off the crowd again. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval, and I guarded the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And I just want to say this, just for us not to miss the significance of this. If it hadn't been for this, the meeting place would not exist. Because I am not of Jewish origin, and I suspect many of you aren't. We would not have access to the story of Jesus if this thing didn't happen. If the story of Jesus didn't get told beyond the first followers of Jesus, who were all Jewish people. And so we have access to the incredible story of Jesus, his death and resurrection, and the promise of eternal life, and all of the promises attached to a relationship with him as a result of this moment. So Jesus is the one to say to Paul, this is your assignment, this is what I would like you to do. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. You can't fault them. They were the chosen nation. They'd been set aside. They were the ones that had the one God. All the nations adjacent to them had multiple gods, but they had the one God. They really felt that they had been chosen specifically. And now Paul was taking this precious thing and he was doing something with it that really was unsettling to them, and so they react. They raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live. Can you imagine? Can you put yourself in that spot where Paul finds himself? Confronted by this mob. In fact, it got so violent that the Romans that are present literally pick him up, and this time they do take him into the barracks. And of course, the commander is trying to figure out, what is actually going on? Well, the best way to get the truth out of a person is flog him. He'll tell us the truth. And so they tie him to the wall. Imagine, here's Paul getting ready to receive his lashes. And he does a typical Paul move. If you read any of his writings, you notice that he does this a few times, and he turns to the person who's tying up and saying, hey, is it okay for you to do this to a Roman citizen? Oops, this is a problem. You can't punish this person. A Roman citizen is due a proper process. So this, of course, gets all the way to the commander's attention, who's freaking out because he's thinking, what am I doing? What's going on? And he believes that he knows who Paul is. He believes that he understands that once again, he's one of these rebellious people that's just causing to make trouble. And Paul explains and says, no, I am not that person. And so what happens? The commander has the wisdom to say, let's turn this to the Jewish authorities, have them sort this out. They'll get to the bottom of this. I don't know why the crowd is so upset, and I don't know why Paul is making so much trouble for me. I can't sort it out. Let's just turn it over to them. And this is the part that I want to insert for you. So in order for you to get the fullness of the passage assigned to this morning, as we're looking at completing the book of Acts this summer, I would encourage you to take the time to read chapter 23, 24, 25, and 26 of Acts. Because what you have happening now, unfolding from this event forward, are a series of trials where Paul is literally being brought in front of different groups of authorities. I'll show you the slide. Well, here's the slide. This is what happens. So the first thing, he meets the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish authority leadership of the moment that the Roman commander turns towards. He's going to meet the governor Felix. He's going to meet Governor Festus. He's going to appeal to Caesar, at which point King Agrippa is going to get involved, and then eventually Paul finds himself off to Rome. So here's a series of things that are going to happen. We don't have time to go through all these. I'm just going to focus on this one for just a moment. So Paul gets hauled in front of the Sanhedrin, and this is what the text says. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." Well, they lose it. At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." Do you know what this means? Do you know where whitewashed walls were? In the tombs. Because Jewish people were careful with being defiled, dealing with dead people. He's essentially calling Ananias a tomb. Can you imagine? You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" But let's really read what this says. Basically saying, this guy is your high priest? Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." And now he's done it again. The text goes on. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all of these things. You see, so he's thrown in a divisive theme. But of course he has to, because the resurrection of Jesus is critical, especially when he's speaking about meeting Jesus after Jesus' death and resurrection and return to the Father, that Paul is claiming to have these conversations with him. Resurrection is critical for that. And so he's thrown this bit into the circle. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. And the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." The third time in the text that we're looking at today where Paul has an encounter with Jesus. There's no evidence in the text that says that Paul is distraught or that he's overwhelmed or that he's anxious or that he's filled with fear. And yet Jesus comes alongside, and it says he stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." And with that, essentially makes a prophecy that Paul would ultimately move from the major city of Jewish faith, Jerusalem, all the way to the major city of the day, the major city of the world, which was Rome, that he would get a chance to share about the story of Jesus in that circle. And this is where you will need to read all those chapters to read about all the trials that follow that ultimately will lead Paul to Rome. But what we have in this text is this. We have a historical piece of writing from the author Luke that is capturing these early movements these early stories of this movement. And you and I can read these things and we can be drawn into the history of it and everything, but in the end, we're not going to learn a lot from the trials other than perhaps Paul's convictions and his clarity about speaking about Jesus. So what is it that we're supposed to draw from this text this morning as you and I are sitting here looking at the story as it unfolds? And I think our focus has to be on the encounters that Paul has with Jesus. And here's the interesting thing. I could have gone to a whole bunch of stories in the Bible and illustrated this happened to people over and over again. They had encounters with Jesus. But like Paul, who stood in front of that crowd and said, look, I just want to tell you my story, and they got quiet enough to listen because we know how compelling personal testimony is. He's about to tell his story, and how could they argue with what he was about to say? And so I want to just tell you a story and then invite you into thinking about this a little bit further. So here's the story. So Hildy and I were invited to meet with a number of pastors from across the U.S. and Canada in a place called Fresno, California. And so we went. I was pumped. Hildy was a little anxious. She does not enjoy flying. But every once in a while, because of the circumstances, she will accept the fact that flights are required, and so she agreed to go. We didn't book the flights. We received the ticket information, so we had no control over our routes. We found ourselves on our way down flying through the city of Denver. Now, the city of Denver, I'm just going to warn you, I'm going to go a little overtime, guys, so I hope you extend grace. But anyways, city of Denver, it's got a beautiful airport. If you've ever been there, it's designed by a Finnish architect. It's a stunning piece of architecture. But a stunning piece of architecture doesn't make flying easier for Hildy. So we arrived in Denver, but Denver is right at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, and the currents that flow through there and the landings and the takeoffs are awful. So it wasn't that great on the way down, but she knew we were going to fly back home the same route. And so one day, we're sitting with all the pastors, and Tiffany. Hildy turns to the pastors and says to them, listen, I just want to say I'm quite anxious about this. Like, I have to go home. This is my only way to get home. And so I have to get on a plane again, which is something I don't enjoy, but then to go through Denver, of all things. And so we're on the plane with a bunch of other people who also been at the conference. We land in Denver. The landing was okay. We waited a little while for our next connection, and then we had the takeoff. Well, at the takeoff, it was awful. The turbulence, it's when the plane does this thing where you're wondering if the wings are going to stay on, right? And I'm not afraid of flying, and I will tell you, it wasn't the most comfortable for me either. The pilot comes on and says, I am so sorry. We're in this turbulence, so we're going to have to go to a higher elevation. Well, I realize when you're flying at 36,000 feet, it doesn't really matter if you're going much higher. But for Hildy, it meant that the takeoff was going to take a little longer because, of course, the plane is still in this position as opposed to leveling out. It was awful. She was distraught. I was clinging to her. I was speaking my best words of reassurance that I could, but she was just having a very difficult time. And suddenly, there's a voice. It came to us between the two seats from one of the pastors who's sitting behind us. And he leans forward and he says to Hildy, I know this is very difficult for you, but right in this moment, can I just invite you to consider, what is Jesus saying to you right now? Yeah, Lisa, this is crazy stuff. That sounds outrageous. That sounds outrageous, right? But I'm going to tell you the truth. I feel that way every time when I'm talking with somebody who's in difficult circumstances. And I say to them, Jesus is near. He has something to say to you, right? Because they could just look at me and roll their eyes and go, you're an idiot. What kind of platitude is that? But the truth of the matter is it made all the difference in the world to Hildy. Because she suddenly realized Jesus is present. I'm not distant from him. He's not going to change the turbulence, or maybe he will. I'm not sure what he's going to do. But yes, he's aware of my circumstances. My anxiety is not foreign to him. So when I say to people, Jesus is present, he would like to speak with you. He has something to say to you in these circumstances. I really, truly mean it. And we experienced in that moment. And we're so grateful for Brad, who's sitting behind us, to do this, to say these words, because it meant the world to us in that moment. And we got home, and here we are, right? This is years ago, but we still tell the story. Here's the thing, my friends. The encounters that Paul has with Jesus, for him, is the world to be interrupted. Yes. For him to turn to Jesus and to actually listen as he goes to the temple. For him to experience the presence of Jesus who comes alongside and says, I am with you, take courage. I have a plan for your future. I have a vision, an imagination for your future. These are real things that could be available to you and I. But do you know why these things sometimes feel like, are they really true? It's because you and I live lives that are so full and so busy and so loud that we hardly have time to even listen to the voice of Jesus. Brad Jerzak, who's been our guest speaker by video a few Sundays in the last number of months, wrote a book some 20 years ago called Can You Hear Me? I recommend this book if you want to know more about hearing the voice of God. Brad Jerzak looks at Scripture and makes this bold claim that God is speaking all the time. He's speaking all the time. And if you and I would just stop to listen, we might be able to hear what he has to say. Paul, who met Jesus on the road to Damascus, whose life was so interrupted that he became so familiar with the voice of God that when he encountered it in the future, he knew this was Jesus speaking. Some of you have those same stories. Some of you know the voice of God. But it's probably true that there are some amongst us who don't know the voice of God. And here is the thing we're going to do about that. Yes, you can buy this book and read more about it. I would recommend it. Second thing is today, after the service, there's always people at the front of the stage to pray. I'm going to be standing over there, sort of underneath the cross. If you want to come and experience something called listening prayer, where we will explore the voice of God together, join me after. We'll spend a little bit of time doing that right here, right now. But here's the last thing I want to say about this. You at TMP, starting on September 13th, Tuesday nights. Here's the thing. 6 to 7, potluck. 7 to 7:30, it's a worship service. No teacher is preparing. We're going to read some scripture. We're going to sing some songs. The prayer team is going to be there to pray. There's going to be silence for us to listen to the voice of God. And anyone who comes has an opportunity to share. We're designating these 30 minutes specifically for the purposes of seeking the voice of Jesus, to hear from the Holy Spirit. And I know you'll say, what, 30 minutes? Listen, my friends, we got to start somewhere. We got to start somewhere. Let's give 30 minutes. Maybe a year from now, it'll be 4 hours. Ooh, some of you are thinking, I'm not going to that. I'm telling you, my friends, this faith community is set for the future to listen to what Jesus has to say to us because we're in desperate need of his voice. Come Tuesday nights, join this thing, be part of it, and we will together become familiar with the voice of Jesus, as Paul was familiar with the voice of Jesus, and it changed his life. Think about the impact he's had and the benefit we've received from his relationship with Jesus. What if you and I are invited to something of similar magnitude? My friends, it's time. Let's become familiar with the voice of Jesus.
Bob, thank you so much for your wisdom and knowledge. We appreciate it as always. So we have a few questions for you. Okay, someone was asking, just to make sure, the first Ananias is different from the high priest, the one that accompanied.
Yes, those are two Ananias.
Okay,
yep.
Sweet. So we have a question regarding Ananias number 1. In the same way he accompanied Saul when he was blind, how do we help those who do not identify as Christians to hear Jesus' voice?
Yeah. Well, I think Paul gives us a really good example of like telling his own story. There's nothing more compelling than your story. What is your Jesus story? And you can share it with people, and they may not agree or they may have difficulties with parts of the story because it's unfamiliar to them, but it's your story to tell. And so I think in some ways the capacity to say, look, this was what my life was like before Jesus was part of the equation. When he entered, this is how he changed me. This is what he made possible in my own life. And perhaps people will then say, that sounds like something that I'm looking for. That sounds like something I should experience. So how do you go about exploring that further? So I would say it's your own story that's going to make all the difference. The thing is that your witness, it's not just your words, but it's your life. People will observe you. If you're there with them for the long haul, even if they have lots of questions for a long period of time, even if they never should choose to follow Jesus, will you be there with them? Will you be the friend, the neighbor, the coworker that just proves to be faithful? That's all part of the witness of our representing Jesus. So.
That's good. Okay, second and last question. This person says, I find so much of my experience of Christianity can feel like a really good book club. Yet, I get the impression that Paul and others in the early church had a mystical experience, an encounter with the risen Jesus. Bob, do you think in our Western and modern context, do we make space to hear Jesus' voice in these mystical experiences or in this kind of way?
Well, the answer is yes. But of course, I don't mean to be a flippant answer. But I would say to you that in some ways, our culture doesn't do us any favors, right? We live in a world where, I hear this all the time, right? I have a question about something because I'm curious about something, and the response always is Google it, right? We live in a world where, in some ways, we think that everything can be discerned, everything can be discovered, everything can be explained. But if you actually dig a little deeper, there are very few people left on the face of the earth who don't also believe that there is an unseen reality, something that encounters us on occasion. I sometimes say, go to a funeral. You never notice how narrow the threshold is between this life and the next as when you're attending a funeral service, because suddenly what happens is you're invited to think beyond. So what are those those moments, those events where you and I might experience the mystical? Well, for me, it is very much about heading out into the woods. When I'm sitting in a place where I'm not confronted by the concrete of my world and I get to see what I see, there's something about taking the time, there's something in the silence, there's something in just being free of those distractions for us to experience the presence of God, the presence of Jesus, the presence of God the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit. And I would say we have to be deliberate. These things are not going to come across our path unless we set aside the time to do it. There are many things that are mystical that we need to make room for, but I think it's ours to in some ways allow for that in our schedule. Now, Paul got interrupted on his way to Damascus, and Jesus barged into his life. When I shared with our team that was leading this morning, and I asked them about their experience with the voice of God, when I talked about the barging, there are several people who nodded their heads because Jesus has barged into their life. And maybe Jesus has barged into your life, and in that moment you engage the mystical because he decided it was time for you to hear his voice. So there's that. But I think for us to spend time and set aside time and say, what do you have for us, I think is a good start.
Thank you, Bob. Would you bless us into the world?
Let's give her a hand. This is her first time doing this. It's amazing, amazing. So great. What a pleasure to be part of this faith community, my friends. Hildy and I were sitting a little bit further to the back, and to hear voices even behind us singing along this morning, there's a real sense of unity. There's a sense of us belonging together and wanting to lean in to what Jesus has for us together, and that's what I would invite you to consider. So the invitation still stands. For anyone who would like to join in the listening prayer, please come and join me at the cross. Pick up Brad Jerzak's book if you want to explore further. And of course, make sure you put on your calendar September 13th. I'd love to see you there. Be blessed. We will see you again next Sunday.